Please be seated. Our reading this morning is from the 12th chapter to the second letter Paul writes to the Corinthians. He says this, he writes this to the church: to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and to keep me from becoming proud. 3 times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That is why I take pleasure in my weaknesses, in the insults, in the hardships, the persecutions, and the troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I'm weak, then I am strong. This is the word of the Lord. I am holding out the idea this morning that for an idea that has radically changed how I understand God, how I see myself, and how I interact with the lives that move near my own. And we live in a day and age, we live in a culture, whether it's spoken or unspoken. It's probably driven, I think, largely by a lot by social media, a lot by what we see and observe around us. But we very much celebrate the idea of perfection and looking perfect. And we work very hard to cover up and to hide our imperfections, our weaknesses. And that is, there is the idea, there is the belief that if we look perfect, if we dress perfect, if we try to live perfectly, then we can somehow minimize our feelings of shame and blame and insecurity. Christianity comes along and challenges all of that and actually says, the Bible says, Jesus upholds the idea, I'm certainly trying to make the case today, that imperfection can actually be a gift from God to lead to greater things. The imperfection can actually be, what I want to say here, a gift. The gift of imperfection. Probably 1,000 different things. Let me just focus on 3. I think this passage is holding out for us. To me, it gives an incredible hope for every one of us in here. And that is, it makes us dependent on Christ, number 1. Secondly, it gives us an empathy, I think, for others, we're going to see here. And thirdly, probably just as great, it gives witness beyond what we can see, what we can observe. All 3 of these here. So let me just walk through these, and I hope my prayers this morning is this impacts you, and I can communicate to you what it's done in my life. First of all, it says here that there's a dependence, the imperfection creates a dependence on Christ. And the reason why we arrive at this is, as Paul says here, to keep me from becoming proud, God basically gave me a thorn in the flesh. Now, the first part here is about the idea, what Paul says here, to keep me from becoming proud. And that is pride. And this is not talking about pride in our work, pride in our children, pride in our athletic teams. There's nothing wrong with trying to be excellent, trying to be working hard and doing your best. This is talking about a pride that is a concentration on ourselves. There is a focus inwardly instead of outwardly. And that is, in the end, it's all about endless ego calculations, saving face, defending ourselves, vindicating ourselves, demanding the respect that we deserve. In other words, what pride does is it leads us away from God and it leads us away from our fellow man. That's what pride does. And this is the reason why Augustine said, I think so rightly 1,600 years ago, pride is not just one sin among many. It is the sin that drives all the other ones. And the quicker we move away from pride, the quicker we will have a dependence on God. And that's why Paul says here, he gives us, many times allows us to have what he calls, he says here, a thorn in the flesh. Now, nobody knows what that was, and there's a lot of debate about this. In the end, it doesn't really matter what it was. All we know is that it was that very thing that caused Paul to rely and be dependent upon Christ, which gets at the heart of the gospel here, because what is the gospel? You hear me say that all the time. It's a twofold thing, and it takes away the pride. And how it does that is we realize when we come to our senses, we realize we're more broken and more sinful or more flawed, we're more imperfect than we can probably even understand, and we know it, and we admit it. And we know we need to depend on God to help us fix it. And that removes the superiority, that we think we're any better than anybody else. But the gospel is not just that, it's the other side of it. And that's because Jesus Christ came to live the life we should have lived and died the death we should have died, because he came in this world just because he loves us. We know at the same time, although flawed, we also know we are more loved and we are more accepted than we ever dared possibly hope for at the very same time. So it removes the inferiority complex. So we don't walk around with our tail between our legs because we know we're loved by a king. We're not superior, we're not inferior. And so it creates a dependence on Christ, on God. It also, I think, one of the things it does is that it creates a humility with us. And it breaks us in a way that we become real. And I've shared this story a few years ago, but one of the profound professors that had an impact on my life in seminary, I'll put his picture up here, was a man named Dr. J.I. Packer, who, by the way, is still alive, 93. The guy's still going. And he's, honestly, I don't think I'm overstating to say he's one of the greatest theologians that have come along in the last 500 years. And he's alive in our lifetime. And I had him for a professor. The most boring class I've ever had in the history of the world, okay? But it was our time spent out of class, which was so instrumental to me. And I remember one night we were eating dinner. I mean, the guy's written all these best-selling books. He's loaded, so he could take us out for dinner, okay, in seminary. And we were sitting around a round table, and we were talking about this very passage that I'm preaching on right now, this very one. And I was really struggling to, how is God's power made perfect in my weakness? I don't understand. And he was saying basically that has anybody ever been of any use in the kingdom of God unless they have not been broken? You show me someone who's prideful, and I will show you someone that will have very little power for the kingdom of God. And not only that, just impact with people around them. God often has to break us and allow us to be broken to be able to use us. And this is what I'll never forget. He said, have you not ever heard of the Velveteen Rabbit? Now, everybody else around the table is shaking their heads like, yeah, and I'm sitting there going, what is he talking about? So I got home that night and asked Lisa about it. She said, oh, I know exactly what he's talking about. And she went and pulled this little book off the shelf. It's a children's book. She pulls it off the shelf, and he kept talking about being real. And she said, I know exactly what he's talking about. She turned to it. She began to read it to me. You remember? She got, her eyes welled up. I know why now. What is real? Asked the rabbit one day inside that nursery fender. Does it mean having things that buzz inside you like a stick-out handle? Real isn't how you're made, said the skin horse. It's a thing that just happens inside of you when a child really, really loves you for a long, long time. Then you become real. Does it hurt? Asked the rabbit. Yeah, sometimes it does, said the skin horse, because he was always truthful, but you don't mind being hurt. Does it happen all at once or just bit by bit? It never happens all at once. It usually takes a long, long time. That's why it doesn't happen to people who are easily broken or who have sharp edges or people who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, okay, this is so true, all your hair has been loved off, right? Your eyes have popped out. You become very loose in the joints. You become very shabby. But those things don't matter anymore. Generally, by the time you're real, you could never be ugly, except to those people who do not understand. So what Dr. Packer taught me 22 years ago, I realize he's exactly right. It makes you real. It gives you substance. And as he said, how can anyone in the world have any kind of impact on somebody unless they know what it's like to be down low, to be imperfect, to be broken. That's how you're made real. And he says, and I remember this, he says, it creates an empathy for others, okay? Not just a dependence on Christ, it creates an empathy for others. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, pride leads you away from God and away from people. It's why we cannot stand watching prideful athletes who think they're better than other people. We are repulsed by that. Yet we're drawn to people who admit their imperfections, who admit their weaknesses, because we can identify with that. Humility is the one thing that draws us closer to God and closer to one another. And that is that few of us can ascend to great heights. Maybe we can sometime in our life, but a lot of us, most of us here can identify what it's like to have just crushing setbacks, incredible lows. We know what it's like to be in depression. We know what it's like to struggle, to have disappointments, to suffer. And Christianity comes along and says, this is the one thing that comes along and says that the gospel has a way of enabling us that he uses our imperfections, not in spite of them, but because of them. God is able to use those very things to help us create relationships with other people that we would never had any other way. And that is, and most of you know this, we all know this in here, but anybody in here who's ever struggled with their mental health, anybody who's ever struggled with depression, or to have really, really low points in your life, seasons of melancholy, which, by the way, statistics say it's at least 50%, probably greater than that. If you've gotten through that, or you're in that, you have such a heart for other people that are struggling, do you not? And we don't judge people when they're down or they're going through depression because we know what it's like to be down in the gutter. We know what it's like to be down in that pit. Think about us in here, alcoholics, struggle with addictions. I know for me, I have such a heart for people who struggle with that. Because not only I watched it in my own life, I watched it in my family's life. I never make any judgment. I know what it's like. I remember. Think of all those in here you're in a tough marriage. Okay, you're struggling, and you meet someone who comes along and says they are also struggling. You don't say, "Don't talk to me." You feel drawn to them because they are in the fight with you. And listen, and everybody here who's ever been a parent knows. Do you remember when we were parenting experts? Okay, before we had children. Right? We go to Walmart and stuff like that. Go, what is wrong with these parents? Why don't they give some discipline to these kids and stuff like that? You know? I'll tell you how I would do it. I wouldn't do it like that. And then 6 kids later, okay, I realized I know absolutely nothing. Because it has a way of reducing you to rubble. And you feel, when other parents tell you they're struggling, they're hurting, you feel that because you know what that's like. It draws you. It gives empathy for one another. And so many times in so many places, the greatest influence we will have, I'm telling you, will not be in our successes. It will be in our imperfection, in our disappointments, in our setbacks. The last thing up here is that it gives us a witness beyond what we can see. Now, I want to share 2 stories with you. One of a profound impact on me and millions of others, and then a personal story of mine that I will try to get through. I'll try to get through it. There's not a week that doesn't go by that sometime, or maybe a month that doesn't go by, you will hear me talk about Mr. C.S. Lewis, right? Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you a story this morning that none of you have ever heard. And that may be hard, considering all the times I talk about him, right? But this is a story about him, and that at his day and age in Oxford, the center of the academic universe at the time, he was one of the supreme debaters in the world at the time, and he used to just chew people up and spit them out in debate, especially when he was debating Christian topics. He was very, very gracious, but he just destroyed you and jumped up and down the bloody remains. Even though he did it in a very British way, he insulted you, and you didn't know it until later on, okay? Well, one time he debated a young philosopher named Elizabeth Anscombe, who had just graduated from Oxford. She had just become a fellow there, a professor at Oxford. And she was just this brilliant young scholastic philosopher who was a Roman Catholic kind of theologian, and Lewis was more this Protestant theologian. And she thought she found some faulty logic in one of his books, and so she debated him in the Socratic Club there in Oxford and just absolutely demolished Lewis, humiliated him publicly. And after it was over, years later, J.R.R. Tolkien would write, friends of his in a letter, he said in all his life he had never seen Lewis that low. He said he came into the pub that night and he sat down in the corner there and he put his hands in his face and he wept uncontrollably. And Tolkien said, British men don't do that at that time. And you never let people see your weaknesses. And he said Lewis was completely devastated because he was humiliated in front of all of Oxford, among all the academia who had been cheering for his demise because he was a Christian. And this happened to him. And what is so unique about this, that Tolkien would write later, it was that night, in his devastation, in his imperfection, in his humiliation, that he changed the direction of his life. That he would move away from writing Christian books, that he went home that night and began to pen the children's books that would change the face of literature. The man who created Narnia. And he would turn his attention to the world beyond the wardrobe. And this is the thing that gets me. It was only through his failure, only through his humiliation, that he gave birth, I think, to one of the greatest figures in the history of fantasy literature, Aslan, the Christ-like lion, who so many people are drawn to for the last 60 years. And just to take this even a step further, this is what's amazing, okay? Every night for the last 3 months, my wife, Lisa, reads the Narnia series to my 9-year-old son, Josiah. And just yesterday, when I was over here in the chapel working this message, I was showing the pictures of Aslan, and he said to me, I so wish I could hold Aslan. I could hug him. I could, touch his mane, that he was real. And I said to Josiah, he is real. He's the person of Jesus Christ. That's why Lewis created him, that children be drawn to him to lead them to a greater glory, the face of Jesus Christ. And what I'm saying to you is that never would have happened if it wasn't for that humiliation that Lewis experienced there in Oxford. Narnia never takes place because of that. And so it brings me back to the passage I preached on a couple weeks ago when I was here, okay? So we don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we gaze on the things that we cannot see. Because Paul goes on to say that this thing here, for the things we can see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see, those are the things that truly will last forever. And so again, it gives witness to what we cannot see. I mean, Lewis could never have seen how far this would echo into the future. We have, but he didn't. And so when I preach on this passage here, that when Paul says, my grace is all you need, for my power is made perfect in your weakness, this is a wonderful passage to preach on, but it is a very difficult passage to live out. Because if you are actually experiencing great weakness, you know how hard it is. And I share this story with you this morning that I only share maybe once a year. Gosh, I realized early that when the earlier service I did this, just how hard it is still talking about this. All right, I will try to get through this. But I realize in sharing this story, this has helped people over the years, and so I share it with you this morning. Many of you know, I've talked about it many times, my struggle with dyslexia. It has plagued me all my life. And through just a ton of hard work, I have gotten around the roadblocks. I've overcome through God's help and through just sheer absolute determination. But if you would have talked to me years ago, I would have told you privately, this was the one huge flaw that God allowed in my life. It was the very thing that I feel like was destroying me, because my great fear was that the world was going to see who I really am, and I'm not going to be able to measure up. And so therefore, I'm going to try to combat this imperfection and insecurity by pleasing, by performing, by perfecting, because after all, we are a society that loves winners. Do we not? I mean, honestly, I look back now, if I came in, when I interviewed for this job and told this, I don't know if I would have gotten the job here. We love winners in our society. And so whenever I have to get up and read something publicly, I will read, I have this thing memorized. I mean, it's there. And so back in, I will often say one of the greatest days of my life and also one of the worst days of my life were the same day. And the reason why I say that is on October 10th, 2001 was a day I will never forget because it was one of the greatest days of my life is because it was when my son Will was born down here. So this is 18 years ago. Earlier in that morning, I had to preach a sermon over at the church I worked in Melbourne, Florida, St. John's. And when I have to preach, that is a day off for me, okay? Because I don't have to read anything. I don't have to do any liturgy. It is a day off. So I showed up that morning thinking I have a message. It's all planned. God had another plan that morning. Because the deacon was supposed to read the Old Testament lesson, didn't show up. And just as the service is starting, the minister I worked with leans over to me and said, I'm feeling incredibly nauseous. I've got to get out of here. You take everything. So I had to get up and read this Old Testament reading. And the only thing I can remember is it was one of those readings that Hebrew phone book type of reading, you know. It's like all these names you can't say. So I started to read it, and I began to struggle. And any dyslexic would tell you, they know this. Those of you who've ever struggled with this know when the panic begins to set in, it's like your brain kicks into overdrive, and you begin to see things that are not there. And I began to say scriptures that weren't in there. I began to say things that weren't in there, and it may sound funny, but it was incredibly painful and awkward. I just imagine me doing this up here. And then to make matters worse, I had to read the gospel lesson. And in that church, we carry it down to the center of the church. We read it in the front of the church. And I remember thinking as I was walking down there, I felt like I was walking to my death. Like I did not want to. You ever been in a situation you don't want to be somewhere, you want to escape? And I couldn't. And that was just as bad. And then I had to get up and preach a sermon after all this. And after the service is over, just to tell you how awkward it was, 400 people in this sanctuary, and I had to shake their hands on the way out. Nobody said a word to me about it. And after it was over, I went back in the sacristy. And I remember I just cried. I couldn't stop. Because it's one thing to be transparent, it's one thing to be honest, it's another thing to be, completely humiliated. And then my phone rings, and Lisa goes, I'm going into labor, get your butt home now, okay? So I'm driving like 60 miles an hour home, okay? And I don't tell Lisa about this for months. Will's born later that afternoon, but I don't know if you know what it's like, but you just can't stop thinking about that. You think about it in the car, you think about it in the shower, you think about it when you're at work, and you just think, how can God use me in this when I've just had this huge struggle? And, I want to fast forward a few years. I later leave this church. I go to plant a church in South Carolina, in Fort Mill. And 8 years later, I'm at a conference in Raleigh. And huge conference there in Raleigh. And I run into some old friends from this old church that I used to work at. And we were sitting in a cafe in this hotel late one night, like 11 o'clock. And then people just began to peel off. And there's one gentleman that stayed behind, and I barely knew him. All I knew, he was very, very wealthy. I knew him only for a few months when I was there. And I asked him, I said, how'd you end up at St. John's? And he looked puzzled. He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, how'd you end up there? And he said, well, because of you. And I said, I don't understand. I don't know what you're talking about. He said, well, back early 2000s, late 1999, my life began to fall apart. My business was struggling. My marriage was struggling. My children didn't want to be around me. And my business partner became a Christian, and he led me to Christ. And he convinced me I had to find a church. And so I began to look for churches in our community. And every church I went to was perfect. Okay? The singers up front were all supermodels. The pastor was perfect. His hair was perfectly coiffed. Everything was perfect. And I wasn't perfect. And I just couldn't connect with people. And then someone invited me to this Episcopal church. I didn't even know what an Episcopal even was. And I went there, and he goes, and you were there, and he said, you got up and you struggled to read. And I kid you not, this is what he said to me that night. You probably don't remember this. Yeah. Oh, I remember it, okay? And he said, and then you had to get up and read again, and then you had to get up and preach a sermon. And he said this to me, it was one of the greatest messages I ever heard in my life. I don't remember any of that. And I remember him saying to me, he said, and I remember thinking, if that kid has the guts, and he used some other language here, okay, to give up and give that message after that, to work through those imperfections, then this is the place for me. And he said to me, you got to know, the day I stepped through those doors, that day I stepped in this church, my heart's never left it. And the thing you got to know is, he gives tens and tens of millions of dollars to global missions now. He sold his company, Lisa knows this, he sold his company a few years later for $356 million. And as he was sitting there in Raleigh telling me the story, the amazing thing I've come to realize now, it didn't matter how much I tried to do to cover my weaknesses. God had an unstoppable plan that day, and nothing I was going to do was going to stop it. Okay, and the humorous thing is that his perfection was made perfect in my weakness. And I've kind of come to the belief now, whether I live another 30 or 40 years or I die tonight, I've come to the belief now, really, the understanding that probably my most humiliating moment in my life will probably end up being my greatest, most fruitful time in ministry. And I didn't do nothing but stand there looking like a bumbling idiot. And I realize now, that God used what I considered a weakness, a flaw, to actually bring someone to a deeper relationship with Christ. In a million years, I could have never have predicted this. And so when Paul says here, okay, that I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can rest on me, and he goes on to say that's why I delight in them. I am not to the delight part yet. I'm working on that, okay? But I know what he's saying. God can work through all of it. And I would dare say that day in 2001, the day my son was born, looking back now is a day that I can now see that I saw God face to face. Because here's the thing I want to take from this. I can look back now and see how God used it, but imagine if I never went to that conference in Raleigh. Imagine if I never heard that story. For the rest of my life, I'm walking around thinking, what good can God ever bring out of this? And I have a feeling there's a lot of us in here that are we don't have the Raleigh thing. We just have nothing but the failure, the imperfection, the setbacks. And what I'm saying to you is, I'm someone who's seen this, maybe this one glance. I have been to the mountaintop. And I have looked over. Just enough to get a glimpse to see that God can use all of it. I'm a testimony to it. And he's taught me 1,000 things about this, but chief among them, until it's all said and done, and we're on the other side of eternity, unless you can see through the sands of time, you just can't say what is fair and what is foul. You can't say that God can't use this. God can use all of it. And so I'm saying with great certainty that God is working through and in our imperfection. It is a gift. It creates a dependence on God. It gives us an incredible empathy for others. And what I'm saying, it also gives a witness that we cannot see that will echo into eternity. God's power is made perfect in our weakness. And so it is with you. Let's pray. Lord, you have come to bring life, to bring light, to shine brighter in us, God, because you are our deliverer. You are our Savior. In your presence, Lord, we can sing and say that we find our strength. And we believe, as your word says, that no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has possibly conceived or even imagined what you have prepared for those who love you. It's in that great love for you that we believe these things. And all of God's people said,